History often feels like a steady climb toward a better future, but that is an illusion. The true story of humanity is written in sudden, shocking disasters that stop a civilization in its tracks. These are not mere endings, they are brutal catalysts, events so powerful they force entire societies to tear down their old world and build a new one from the ashes. Today, we explore 25 of these pivotal catastrophes, moments when everything changed. From the silent abandonment of ancient cities to the economic collapses that reshaped our modern world, we will see how each disaster forced a fundamental reorganization of politics, economy, faith, and daily life. By the end, you will understand the hidden rhythm of history, a cycle of collapse and rebirth that defines our species. How did a single plague create the conditions for the Renaissance? Why did mighty empires shatter almost overnight, giving rise to entirely new ways of living? The answers reveal a startling truth about our own fragile world. What do you believe is the greatest force for change in human history? Our journey begins not with a single empire falling, but with an entire interconnected world going dark. Around the year 1200 before the Common Era, the vibrant civilizations ringing the Eastern Mediterranean suffered a synchronized failure into a centuries-long silence historians call the Bronze Age collapse. In a span of just 50 years, the mighty Hittite Empire vanished. The prosperous city-states of Mycenaean Greece were abandoned. The great trading centers of Ugarit and Troy were sacked and burned. The Egyptian New Kingdom, though it survived, was left battered and impoverished, its pharaohs recording desperate battles against mysterious invaders they called the Sea Peoples. This was not a gradual decline. It was a sudden, catastrophic systems failure. The cause was a perfect storm of disasters that fed upon one another. A prolonged period of severe drought, revealed by ancient pollen samples and tree rings, crippled agricultural production across the region. Famine weakened populations and strained the complex, interdependent trade networks that were the lifeblood of these palace-centered economies. When harvests failed and tin and copper for bronze became scarce, the entire economic system began to shudder. Into this vulnerability came the enigmatic Sea Peoples, likely a confederation of displaced groups from across the Mediterranean, who raided coastlines and shattered what remained of political order. Some scholars suggest internal rebellions by overtaxed peasants and neglected outlying communities delivered the final blows to already fragile kingdoms. The reorganization that followed was total. The centralized, bureaucratic palace economies, with their scribes recording every jar of oil and every sheaf of wheat, disappeared. The advanced linear B script of the Mycenaeans was forgotten in Greece, ushering in a centuries-long Greek Dark Age where literacy was lost. Grand cities were left empty, their populations scattering into smaller, fortified hilltop villages focused on survival, not empire. Out of this fragmentation, however, new forms of society were forged. The isolation forced communities to become more self-sufficient. The difficult technology of working iron, once a rare curiosity, became widespread out of necessity as the tin trade for bronze had collapsed. This paved the way for the Iron Age, and in the power vacuum, new identities crystallized. The Phoenicians, survivors in their coastal cities, turned to the sea and pioneered an alphabet that would spread across the ancient world. In the highlands of Canaan, scattered tribes coalesced into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The collapse of the old Bronze Age order did not end history. It cleared the stage, making room for an entirely new cast of characters and ideas to emerge from the ashes. The silence that followed the Bronze Age collapse was a reset, a period where old systems dissolved so new ones could form. Centuries later, another foundational pillar of the ancient world would fracture, but this time its fall echoed for 1,000 years, creating the very blueprint for a new age. The catastrophe was not merely the sacking of a city, but the total disintegration of a centralized imperial state in the West. For generations, the story of Rome's end was told as a simple tale of barbarian invasions, but the truth is a far more complex and instructive collapse. The Roman Empire did not fall to a single enemy at the gate. It succumbed to a catastrophic confluence of internal failures that left it unable to withstand external pressure. The empire had become dangerously overextended, its vast borders stretching from Britain to Syria, requiring a massive and costly military just to maintain a fragile peace. This military burden, coupled with centuries of economic stagnation, heavy taxation, and a debilitating reliance on slave labor, slowly drained the state's vitality. Political instability became the norm, with emperors rising and falling in rapid, often violent succession, eroding any sense of unified governance. Into this growing weakness poured the mass migrations of entire peoples, groups like the Visigoths and Vandals, who were often fleeing even greater threats from the east. They were not mindless destroyers, but desperate populations seeking safety within the empire's borders, who eventually found that the empire could no longer control or integrate them. The reorganization that followed this collapse was profound and total. The single, unifying authority of a Roman emperor in the West vanished. In its place emerged a patchwork of decentralized, often warring Germanic kingdoms. The complex Roman economy, with its long-distance trade and currency, shattered into localized, self-sufficient manners. This was the birth of the feudal system, a societal structure built on personal loyalty and land ownership for protection in a dangerous world. Yet, amidst this political fragmentation, one institution endured and grew to fill the void: the Christian Church. It preserved literacy, administered what remained of civil order, and provided a spiritual and cultural framework that slowly knit the diverse peoples of Europe together. Meanwhile, the torch of Roman administration, law, and high culture shifted east to the Byzantine Empire based in Constantinople, which would thrive for another 1,000 years. The fall of Rome was not the end of civilization, but a brutal, centuries-long reorganization that dismantled an ancient world to create the very foundations of medieval Europe. While the Western Roman Empire fragmented into kingdoms, its eastern half in Constantinople endured as a mighty fortress of classical order. Under Emperor Justinian, it even dreamed of reclaiming the lost western provinces, a grand ambition of reuniting the Roman world. Then, in the year 541, a silent passenger arrived in the bustling port of Constantinople, carried by rats on grain ships from Egypt. It was Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, and its arrival unleashed what historians recognize as the first recorded pandemic in human history. The Plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. Contemporary accounts describe a city brought to its knees. The historian Procopius, who witnessed the horror, wrote of victims developing sudden fevers and the telltale swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, before a rapid decline. The death toll was staggering. At its peak, the plague is said to have claimed 10,000 lives in Constantinople every single day, bodies piled in the streets for lack of space to bury them. Modern estimates suggest the pandemic may have killed between 25 and 50% of the entire population of the Eastern Mediterranean over 2 centuries of recurring waves. This was not just a tragedy of individual loss. It was a demographic earthquake that shattered the foundations of Justinian's empire. The reorganization it forced was comprehensive and irreversible. Justinian's grand project of reconquering Italy and North Africa, which had seen initial brilliant successes under his general Belisarius, was now financially and militarily impossible. The empire's tax base evaporated as farmers, artisans, and soldiers perished. agricultural land fell fallow, trade networks seized up, and the once robust economy contracted into a desperate, simplified state of local survival. In this vacuum of secular power and amidst overwhelming communal grief, the influence of the Christian Church expanded dramatically. It became the primary source of charity, spiritual solace, and even civil administration, further intertwining religious and political authority in the Byzantine world. The state that emerged from the plague was a permanently weakened one. Its armies were depleted, its coffers empty, and its ability to project power diminished. This profound vulnerability, created by the plague's relentless scythe, set the stage for the next great reorganization of the region. Just over a century later, when the newly unified forces of Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, they encountered a Byzantine frontier that was a shadow of its former strength, a hollowed-out shell still reeling from a biological disaster. The ease of their early conquests, which permanently reshaped the cultural and political map of the Middle East and North Africa, can be traced directly back to the devastating emptiness the plague had left behind. A microbe, unseen and unfightable, had done what no barbarian army could achieve. It crippled a superpower and altered the destiny of continents. Centuries after the Plague of Justinian, on the other side of the world, another civilization of staggering achievement faced its own silent, creeping catastrophe. The great stone cities of the classic Maya, with their soaring pyramids and intricate calendars, did not fall to an outside invader. They were simply walked away from. Between the 8th and 9th centuries of the Common Era, the heartland of Maya civilization in the southern lowlands experienced a near-total societal disintegration. One by one, magnificent urban centers like Tikal, Palenque, and Kapan ceased to carve their elaborate stone monuments. Their royal courts fell silent, and their populations dwindled until the jungle reclaimed the plazas and temples. This was not a single event, but a slow-motion unraveling, a systems failure where multiple pressures converged into an inescapable trap. The primary suspect is a prolonged and severe megadrought, a climatic shift revealed in sediment cores from nearby lakes that shows over a century of drastically reduced rainfall. For a society utterly dependent on seasonal rains for agriculture and drinking water, this was a death sentence, but the Maya were not passive victims of the weather. Their own success had made them more vulnerable. Centuries of intensive farming, including deforestation to create more farmland and plaster for their monuments, likely exacerbated local drying and soil depletion. At the same time, endemic warfare between rival city-states, once a ritualized affair to capture nobles for ceremony, appears to have escalated into total conflict, draining resources and shattering the fragile alliances that maintained order. The divine kings, the Kayuhul Ajor, who claimed a direct link to the gods and guaranteed the rains and harvests, faced a crisis of legitimacy when the rains failed and the wars were lost. Their spiritual contract with the people was broken. The reorganization that followed this collapse was a profound reimagining of Maya society. Political and cultural power did not vanish, it migrated. It shifted north to the Yucatan Peninsula, to flourishing post-classic centers like Chichen Itza and Mayapan. Here, the model of rule transformed. The cult of the single, god-like king gave way to more collective forms of governance, like councils of noble lineages or shared rule among allied families. This was a practical adaptation, a move away from centralized, vulnerable power. The economic focus also shifted dramatically. With the great inland agricultural heartland depopulated, the northern cities thrived by turning outward, becoming hubs in vast maritime trade networks that stretched along the coastlines, dealing in salt, cotton, cacao, and obsidian. The post-classic Maya world was less about monumental cosmic kingship and more about commerce, diplomacy, and adaptable, decentralized power. They preserved their writing, their astronomical knowledge, and their cultural identity, but they rebuilt their civilization on entirely new foundations, proving that collapse is not an end but a brutal creative pivot. The Maya had proven that even the most brilliant civilizations can be undone by a changing sky and a broken social contract. A similar story of architectural wonder and sudden abandonment unfolded a world away, not in a tropical jungle, but in the stark, breathtaking landscapes of the American Southwest. Here, a people we often call the Anasazi, though their modern descendants prefer the term ancestral Puebloans, built incredible multi-story stone pueblos and entire cities tucked into sheer cliff faces, like the awe-inspiring Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde. Then, around the year 1300 of the Common Era, they walked away from these magnificent homes for good. The silence they left behind is one of North America's most haunting historical mysteries. What could drive a people to abandon generations of labor and sacred space? The evidence points not to a single enemy, but to an environmental vise that slowly tightened over decades. Tree ring records tell a stark story, a period of relentless aridity known as the Great Drought, which gripped the region for nearly half a century. In an already dry land where successful farming was a delicate balance, this mega-drought was catastrophic. Springs and streams vital for drinking water and irrigation dwindled or vanished entirely. Crop yields failed repeatedly, straining food stores to their limit. This environmental pressure likely amplified other tensions. Some archaeologists suggest that generations of intensive farming and gathering firewood may have depleted local resources, forcing people to travel farther for necessities. There is also evidence of increased conflict in this period, with some settlements showing signs of burning and their locations shifting to more defensible, difficult-to-reach positions. It seems a perfect storm of drought, scarcity, and social strain made the old way of life in these great population centers unsustainable. The reorganization that followed was not an end, but a profound dispersal and cultural adaptation. The large, concentrated communities splintered. Families and clan groups migrated, some moving south and east, following the promise of more reliable water sources. They did not vanish, they transformed. From this great movement, the historic Pueblo peoples like the Hopi and the Zuni coalesced in new areas. Their social and spiritual world adapted to the lessons of the collapse. The immense, centralized pueblos gave way to smaller, more scattered villages, a strategy that reduced risk and spread population pressure. Their religious life, always deeply connected to the land and the cycles of rain, likely intensified in its focus on community harmony and prayer for sustenance, practices that ensured resilience in a challenging environment. The abandonment of Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon was not a disappearance. It was a strategic retreat and a cultural evolution, a society reorganizing itself from large, vulnerable monuments into smaller, more mobile, and deeply resilient communities whose descendants maintain a continuous cultural thread to this day. The resilience of the ancestral Puebloans shows how societies can adapt to environmental pressure, but some catastrophes strike with such ferocity they rewrite the very rules of society. In the middle of the 14th century, a biological disaster of unimaginable scale swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague, did not just cause immense personal loss, it delivered a systemic shock to the medieval world so profound that the old order could never be rebuilt. Arriving via trade routes from Central Asia, the plague moved with terrifying speed. Within just a few years, it is estimated to have claimed the lives of between 30% and 60% of Europe's entire population. Whole villages were emptied, cities became ghost towns, and the sheer scale of loss overwhelmed every institution of medieval life, from the family to the monarchy. The immediate horror, however, was only the beginning. The true catastrophe was the vacuum it created, an emptiness that forced a complete economic and social reorganization. With so many people gone, the land was still there, but the hands to work it were desperately scarce. This simple fact of supply and demand shattered the centuries-old manorial system, the feudal backbone of medieval Europe. Lords who had once commanded cheap labor now found themselves competing for workers. Peasants and serfs who were once bound to the land suddenly possessed newfound bargaining power. They could demand and receive higher wages for their work or simply leave their manor to seek better opportunities elsewhere. This was nothing short of a revolution in social relations. Governments trying to protect the old elite passed laws to cap wages and force people to stay in their old jobs, but these measures largely failed against the unstoppable tide of economic reality. The old hierarchies were crumbling from the bottom up. At the same time, the plague delivered a severe blow to the spiritual authority of the Catholic Church. Its priests had died in droves alongside their flocks, and its prayers and rituals had clearly failed to halt the pandemic. This crisis of faith led to widespread disillusionment, opening space for questioning and new religious movements that would later fuel the Reformation. The collective trauma also sparked a turn inward, a greater focus on individual experience and earthly life that art historians see as a precursor to the humanist thought of the Renaissance. Furthermore, the desperate labor shortage accelerated innovation out of sheer necessity. If you could not find enough people to work the fields, you needed to make each worker more productive. This urgency spurred investments in labor-saving technologies, from improved plows to the early mechanization of processes like fulling cloth. The social mobility unleashed by the plague, the questioning of old authorities, and the drive for efficiency did not cause the Renaissance directly, but they created the essential conditions for it. They cleared the intellectual and economic space for a new world to be born from the ashes of the old, proving that from the deepest despair can come the most radical rebirth. But the rebirth that followed the Black Death was a slow, internal transformation of Europe. Sometimes the force for reorganization comes not from within, but from the outside, arriving with the thunder of hooves and the flash of steel. In the 13th century, a storm gathered on the steppes of Central Asia that would deliver a catastrophic external shock to civilizations from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. The Mongol invasions under leaders like Genghis Khan and his successors were not merely a series of military campaigns. They were a deliberate, systematic dismantling of the existing world order. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Chronicles from Persia to Russia speak of cities reduced to ash, populations scattered or lost, and entire libraries of knowledge consumed by flames. The demographic impact was staggering, with some regions in Central Asia and the Middle East taking centuries to recover their former population levels. Existing political structures, from the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia to the fractured principalities of Kievan Rus, were shattered, their rulers replaced or subjugated. This was a catastrophe of the highest order, a violent end to one era. Yet, from this chaos emerged a paradoxical and profound reorganization, a period historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Once the conquests were complete, the Mongols established the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary. Their genius was not just in conquest but in administration. They imposed a strict, if harsh, stability across their domains, suppressing local warfare and banditry along the major trade routes. For the first time, a merchant could travel from the ports of the Black Sea all the way to the capital of China, Khanbalik, under the protection of a single imperial authority. This forced integration of the Eurasian trade routes was revolutionary. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed with unprecedented freedom. Chinese innovations like gunpowder, papermaking, and the compass moved westward. Persian administrative techniques and Islamic astronomy traveled east. Even the humble posta may have made its way from Asia to Italy during this period. This cultural and commercial exchange under the Pax Mongolica laid the groundwork for the connected world of the early modern era. The political reorganization was equally significant. In China, Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty, a Mongol ruling house that unified the region and famously hosted the Venetian traveler Marco Polo. In the West, the Golden Horde established its rule over the Russian principalities, a domination that lasted for centuries and profoundly shaped Russian concepts of statehood, centralization, and its relationship with both Europe and Asia. The Mongol invasions were a catastrophe of unimaginable violence, but the world that emerged from their shadow was more interconnected, more aware of its own breadth, and set on a new course. They proved that a single external force could break a dozen different civilizations, only to fuse their pieces into a new, if temporary, whole. The world the Mongols connected was about to be torn apart by a collision far more devastating. When Spanish conquistadors landed on the shores of Mexico in 1519, they did not just bring soldiers and steel. They brought an invisible army of pathogens against which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no defense. The fall of the Aztec Empire at Tenochtitlan was a military event, but the true catastrophe was a biological and cultural collapse that erased entire worlds. While the tactical alliance between Hernan Cortés and rival city-states like Tlaxcala was crucial, the decisive factor was a silent ally, smallpox. The disease, carried by a single infected member of the Spanish expedition, swept through the densely populated valley of Mexico in 1520. It ravaged a population with no prior exposure and thus no immunity. The ruler Cuitlahuac, who had just succeeded in expelling the Spanish from Tenochtitlan, was among its first and most significant victims, dying after just 80 days in power and throwing the empire into disarray at its most vulnerable moment. The loss of life was incomprehensible. Within a century, it is estimated that up to 90% of the indigenous population of Mesoamerica had passed away due to a series of introduced illnesses, from smallpox and measles to typhus and influenza. This was not merely a defeat. It was a demographic catastrophe that emptied landscapes and shattered the social and economic fabric of a continent. The reorganization that followed was total, brutal, and designed to erase the old order while extracting every ounce of wealth from the new. Spanish colonial administration was imposed, dismantling the complex tribute and alliance networks of the Aztec Triple Alliance and replacing them with a European model of viceroyalties and audiencias. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities, forcing them to provide labor and tribute in a form of legalized exploitation that differed little from slavery in practice. A spiritual conquest marched hand in hand with the military one. Franciscan, Dominican, and Augustinian friars embarked on a massive campaign to convert millions to Christianity. They systematically dismantled temples, often building their own churches directly on the sacred sites, a physical symbol of the new spiritual order. Indigenous codices, the painted books that held history, ritual, and knowledge, were burned as works of the devil. This was an attempt at cultural annihilation. Yet from this violent imposition, a new, complex society was forcibly born. It was not purely Spanish, nor could it ever be fully indigenous again. Instead, a fusion occurred, often under duress, creating the layered, hierarchical colonial world of New Spain. Indigenous artists and laborers, using their own techniques and symbols, built the Baroque churches that now dot the Mexican landscape, embedding subtle nods to their old gods within Catholic iconography. The Spanish language absorbed thousands of Nahuatl words, especially for local plants, animals, and places. Foods blended, giving the world maize tortilla as alongside wheat bread and chocolate sweetened with cane sugar. This mestiçage, the mixing of peoples and cultures, created a new social hierarchy with Spaniards born in Europe at the top, their American-born descendants below them, and the vast indigenous population at the bottom, bearing the heaviest burdens. The conquest was a single, sharp catastrophe that triggered a long, painful reorganization, forging a new identity from the ashes of two colliding worlds, an identity that continues to define the region to this day. While empires clashed in the New World, a far quieter and more pervasive catastrophe was reshaping the entire globe. Beginning in the 14th century and lasting into the 19th, a climatic shift known as the Little Ice Age brought a persistent chill to the world. This was not a single event, but a centuries-long period of cooler temperatures, advancing glaciers, and wildly unpredictable weather that challenged the very foundations of agricultural societies everywhere. Its peak impacts, particularly during the 17th century, delivered a cascade of failures that forced dramatic reorganizations across continents. The primary mechanism of this disaster was simple and devastating: growing seasons shortened, and harvests repeatedly failed. In Europe, the Thames River in London froze over so solidly that annual frost fairs were held on its icy surface, a charming image that masked widespread hardship. Repeated years of cold, wet summers led to catastrophic crop losses, triggering severe famines. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 and the later subsistence crisis of the 1740s were direct results of this climatic misery. Widespread hunger fueled social unrest as desperate populations rioted over bread prices and questioned the legitimacy of governments that could not feed them. This pervasive instability created a tinderbox of resentment, a contributing factor to the immense social and religious tensions that exploded into the 30 Years' War, a conflict that devastated Central Europe. The reorganization demanded by this prolonged crisis was one of adaptation and, in some cases, total retreat. Nowhere is this clearer than in the fate of the Norse Greenland colony. Established during the warmer medieval warm period, the Norse settlers clung to a European lifestyle, raising dairy cattle and relying on trade with Iceland and Norway. As the Little Ice Age intensified, sea ice expanded, cutting off vital supply routes for years at a time. The shorter, cooler summers made it impossible to grow enough fodder for their livestock, while the Inuit neighbors, with their adaptable technology of sealskin clothing and kayaks, thrived. The Norse colony, unable or unwilling to fully adopt Inuit survival strategies, slowly starved and faded into oblivion, a stark lesson in the perils of cultural rigidity in the face of environmental change. Across the world in China, climatic stress helped topple a dynasty. The Ming dynasty, in its final decades, was rocked by a series of calamities, but a core component was the relentless pressure of the Little Ice Age. Unusually cold and dry conditions in the 17th century led to repeated droughts and catastrophic harvest failures in northern China, causing widespread famine. This immense suffering fueled massive peasant rebellions, like that led by Li Zicheng, which captured Beijing in 1644. As the rebel forces entered the capital, the last Ming emperor took his own life. The dynasty's collapse, hastened by famine and revolt, created a power vacuum that was swiftly filled by the invading Manchu forces, who established the Qing dynasty. The Little Ice Age did not cause the Ming fall alone, but it supplied the critical, destabilizing hardship that broke the empire's back. Even in North America, the cooling climate redirected the course of societies. For some indigenous nations in the upper Midwest and Northeast, prolonged cooler temperatures and altered animal migration patterns likely contributed to decisions to relocate, sometimes bringing groups into conflict over diminishing resources. These shifting migration and alliance patterns were part of the complex landscape that European colonists would encounter and often misunderstand. The Little Ice Age was a global catastrophe with local consequences, a slow-moving disaster that didn't destroy cities with armies, but with frost and hunger, proving that the climate itself can be the most powerful reorganizing force of all. The chill of the Little Ice Age created a continent of hungry, desperate people, a tinderbox waiting for a single spark. That spark came in the heart of Europe, igniting a conflict so devastating it would become the very definition of catastrophe for generations. The 30 Years' War, which raged from 1618 to 1648, began as a localized religious dispute in Bohemia, but rapidly spiraled into a continental nightmare of unimaginable scale. It was a perfect storm of dynastic ambition, deep-seated sectarian hatred, and the brutal realities of early modern warfare, all set against a backdrop of climatic hardship. The destruction was not confined to battlefields. Armies of mercenaries living off the land systematically plundered towns and countryside alike to sustain themselves, a practice that led to repeated cycles of famine and epidemic disease. The human cost defies comprehension. In the German states which formed the war's primary theater, the population may have fallen by a staggering 30 to 40%. In some regions, the loss was even more severe. This was not just death by the sword, but by starvation, exposure, and outbreaks of illnesses like typhus and plague that swept through weakened, displaced populations. Whole provinces were left desolate, their fields untended and their villages empty shells. The social and economic fabric of Central Europe was not just torn, it was unraveled thread by thread over 3 decades of relentless suffering. From this abyss of destruction, however, emerged a new political order for the continent, one painstakingly negotiated in a series of treaties known as the Peace of Westphalia. This diplomatic settlement was a direct response to the catastrophic failure of the old systems, and its principles would reorganize European politics for centuries to come. The most fundamental shift was the establishment of the modern state system based on the concept of sovereignty. The peace treaties effectively ended the medieval dream of a unified Christendom under the dual authority of Pope and Holy Roman Emperor. Instead, they recognized each prince within the empire and each kingdom outside of it as the supreme authority within their own borders, free from external interference in their domestic affairs. This was a monumental decentralization of power. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled the Holy Roman Empire and sought to dominate Europe in the name of the Catholic faith, saw its imperial ambitions severely checked. Their power was now balanced by the explicit recognition of other major players. France, under the shrewd leadership of Cardinal Mazarin, emerged as the preeminent power on the continent, its influence vastly increased. Sweden gained substantial territories in northern Germany, establishing itself as a major Baltic force. Perhaps the most poignant reorganization was spiritual, codified in the revived principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm his religion. This meant the ruler of each territory had the right to determine whether his subjects would be Lutheran or Catholic, a rule that extended to Calvinism as well. For ordinary people, this often meant a heartbreaking choice: conform to the faith of their prince or leave their homes, their land, and their community forever. It brutally redrew the religious map of Europe, cementing the permanent division of Christendom and making religious uniformity a matter of state borders rather than universal truth. The Peace of Westphalia did not create a utopia. It created a system, a framework of recognized states that would compete, ally, and fight within a new set of rules. It replaced a war of total belief with a diplomacy of calculated interest, arguing that even in the wake of unimaginable loss, some order was better than none. The war had proven that unchecked religious and dynastic conflict could lead to civilizational collapse, and the peace was a desperate, pragmatic blueprint to ensure it would never happen again, a reorganization born from the ashes of a continent that had nearly consumed itself. The political order crafted at Westphalia was a system of states, but across the Atlantic, a far more brutal system was being built, one that treated human beings as a commodity. The transatlantic movement of people, which unfolded over 4 centuries, stands as a long-term, man-made catastrophe of such immense scale it forcibly reorganized societies on both sides of the ocean. This was not a single event, but an industrialized process of displacement that extracted an estimated 12 million individuals from their homes in West and Central Africa, with millions more lost to the hardships of the journey. The human toll is a foundational trauma of the modern world, a forced migration that emptied regions and severed countless cultural lineages forever. Its impact on Africa was catastrophic and deliberate. The relentless demand for captives by European traders destabilized entire political landscapes. While some older inland empires crumbled under the pressure, new militarized kingdoms rose along the coast, their power and wealth built almost entirely on controlling the trade. Kingdoms like Dahomey and the Asante Confederacy organized their societies around raiding and warfare to supply the European forts, turning neighbor against neighbor and creating a pervasive climate of fear and insecurity that reshaped social structures for generations. The reorganization on the American side of the ocean was the construction of an entirely new economic and social world. To replace the labor lost by the devastating impact of introduced illnesses on indigenous populations, European colonies turned to this system of forced labor on an industrial scale. The plantation was born, a factory in the field designed for the mass production of sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. These plantations were engines of incredible wealth for Europe, but they were built and sustained by a system of such profound cruelty it demanded a new ideology to justify itself. Thus, a pseudoscientific framework of racial hierarchy was developed and codified into law, a set of ideas created to rationalize the permanent, hereditary subjugation of people of African descent. This ideology of racial difference became a poison woven into the very fabric of the new societies being built, from the southern colonies of North America to the Caribbean and Brazil. Yet within this brutal system, the most profound reorganization of all was cultural and spiritual. Enslaved individuals, brought from diverse ethnic groups and speaking different languages, faced the systematic attempt to strip them of their heritage. From this intentional fragmentation, they forged something entirely new. They blended linguistic fragments to create new Creole languages. They merged spiritual beliefs and practices from across West and Central Africa with elements of Christianity to form distinct new faiths, like Vodou in Haiti or Candomblé in Brazil, which provided solace, community, and a framework for resistance. They transformed European musical forms with African rhythms and storytelling traditions, giving birth to the blues, jazz, and countless other genres that would eventually captivate the globe. The catastrophe of the transatlantic system did not erase cultures. It forced their painful, powerful fusion, creating resilient new identities and artistic expressions that would fundamentally reshape the demographic and cultural map of the Americas, leaving a legacy that is both a testament to profound suffering and an undeniable pillar of the modern world. A single crop failure can topple an empire, but what happens when that failure becomes the very foundation of a nation's identity? In the middle of the 19th century, Ireland was not a sovereign nation, but a deeply impoverished part of the United Kingdom, where a colonial system of land ownership had forced millions of tenant farmers to subsist on a single, miraculous crop, the potato. It was nutritious, it was productive, and it grew well on small plots of land. Then, in the autumn of 1845, a quiet horror appeared in the fields. A mysterious blight, a fungal pathogen known as Phytophthora infestans, turned healthy potato plants into black, slimy ruins overnight. The potatoes themselves rotted in the ground or in storage pits, becoming a putrid, inedible mass. This was the beginning of Ngorta More, the Great Hunger. The blight was a biological disaster, but the famine that followed was a political and economic one. While harvests failed repeatedly over the next several years, Ireland remained a net exporter of food. Vast quantities of grain, livestock, and other produce were shipped under armed guard from Irish ports to England, because the land was owned by absentee landlords and the crops were grown for cash rent, not for local sustenance. The British government's relief efforts, rooted in laissez-faire economic ideology that opposed market interference, were tragically inadequate. Public works projects provided starvation wages, and the infamous workhouses became overcrowded centers of disease and despair. Soup kitchens arrived too late for many. The failure of these policies transformed a crop disaster into a demographic catastrophe. The reorganization of Ireland was brutal and absolute. Over 1 million people are estimated to have perished from starvation and related illnesses. Another 2 million, out of a total population of 8 million, fled the country in a desperate wave of emigration, most of them to North America. This hollowed out the island, leaving ghost villages and silent fields. But from this profound trauma, a new political consciousness was forged. The famine seared a deep, collective memory of neglect and injustice into the Irish psyche, intensifying nationalist sentiment and anti-British resentment. It became the central, painful rallying point for movements like the Fenians and later Sinn Féin, who argued that only Irish self-rule could prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. The catastrophe also created a global Irish diaspora, particularly in the United States and Canada. These communities, born from hardship, would grow in influence and wealth, often sending vital financial support back to the homeland and lobbying for the cause of Irish independence, creating a transatlantic network of cultural and political power. In Ireland itself, the famine forced a long-term reorganization of agriculture and land tenure. The old system of subdividing tiny plots for potato farming was recognized as untenable. Later land acts, driven by continued agitation, eventually broke up the large estates and enabled tenant farmers to purchase their own land, shifting the country slowly toward mixed farming and pasture. The Great Hunger was more than a famine. It was a crucible that burned away an old way of life and forged a modern Irish nation, its politics, its global family, and its enduring memory shaped forever by those years of darkness. Even as Ireland faced its Great Hunger, a different kind of famine was fueling a firestorm on the other side of the world. In the middle of the 19th century, China's Qing dynasty was buckling under immense internal pressure. A population boom had strained land resources, corruption among officials was rampant, and economic hardship was widespread, especially in the south. Into this tinderbox walked a failed scholar named Hong Xiuquan. After a series of vivid visions he interpreted through translated Christian pamphlets, Hong became convinced he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to rid China of demonic forces, which he identified as the Manchu rulers and traditional Confucian idols. His syncretic theology, blending Protestant ideas with Chinese millenarian tradition, ignited a revolutionary movement among the poor and disaffected. In 1851, he proclaimed the heavenly kingdom of great peace, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and a civil war of unimaginable ferocity began. This was not a minor uprising. It was a total war for the soul of China, and it would become one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The Taiping armies, driven by religious fervor and a radical social program that included the abolition of private property and the promotion of gender equality in theory, swept north from their base. They captured the great city of Nanjing, making it their capital for over a decade. The fighting was apocalyptic in its scale and devastation. Major population centers like Wuhan and Suzhou changed hands repeatedly, often with catastrophic consequences for the civilians caught in between. The loss of life remains almost incomprehensible, with scholarly estimates ranging from 20 to 30 million people over the course of 14 years. This staggering figure includes not only those lost in battle, but the far greater numbers who perished due to famine and the spread of illness that inevitably followed in the war's wake. The economic and cultural heartland of central China, some of the most fertile and densely populated regions on Earth, was left in ruins. From this cataclysm, a profound and unintended reorganization of Chinese power began. The Qing dynasty's Manchu-led 8 banner armies, once the fearsome instrument of conquest, proved hopelessly corrupt and ineffective against the Taiping. To survive, the imperial court in Beijing had no choice but to turn to powerful Han Chinese scholar officials and allow them to raise regional militias from their home provinces. The most famous of these was the Xiang army, organized by the brilliant statesman Zheng Guofan. These were not traditional imperial forces, but personal armies loyal to their Han commanders, funded through local taxes and imbued with a Confucian ideological crusade to save the traditional order. With brutal efficiency, Zheng and his peers like Lai Hongzhang methodically encircled and strangled the Taiping Rebellion, finally recapturing Nanjing in 1864. The rebellion was crushed, but the old China was gone. The reorganization was irreversible. Power had decisively shifted from the Manchu elite in Beijing to Han Chinese strongmen in the provinces who now commanded modern, loyal armies and controlled their own finances. The central authority of the Qing court was permanently weakened, surviving only at the pleasure of these regional powers. This devolution of authority set a dangerous precedent. It created a pattern where provincial loyalties could outweigh national ones, a fissure in the body politic that foreign powers and later revolutionaries would exploit. The decades that followed saw a series of further crises, from humiliating defeats in wars with foreign powers to more internal rebellions. Each one further eroded the dynasty's legitimacy and strengthened regional autonomy. The Taiping Rebellion, therefore, did not just cause immense suffering, it broke the central mechanism of Qing rule. It forced a reorganization of military and political power to the provinces, beginning a century of instability that the weakened dynasty could never reverse, setting the stage for its final collapse in the Revolution of 1911 and the chaotic warlord era that followed. The devastation of the Taiping Rebellion revealed how a fractured state could be torn apart from within. A similar, defining fracture would soon rip through a young nation across the Pacific, one built on a fundamental contradiction. The American Civil War was far more than a military contest between North and South. It was a catastrophic collision over the nation's economic soul and moral future. A conflict so total it would force a violent and unfinished reorganization of American society itself. At its heart was the system of slavery, the immense engine of wealth for the southern states, which produced the cotton that fueled the global textile industry. The war, ignited by southern states seceding to protect that system, became a furnace of transformation. The most profound reorganization was the legal end of slavery, achieved through President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. This was not merely a political decree, it was a revolutionary dismantling of the entire social and economic foundation of the 11 Confederate states. Overnight, 4 million individuals transitioned from being legally classified as property to being free citizens, a change that demanded a complete redefinition of labor, family, and community in the South. Yet this promise of freedom immediately collided with the harsh reality of what would come next. The period known as Reconstruction was the nation's fraught attempt to manage this staggering reorganization. For a brief, remarkable time, the federal government asserted unprecedented authority, stationing troops in the South and passing civil rights amendments to protect the newly freed population. African American men voted, held political office, and began to build independent lives, founding schools, churches, and seeking land of their own. But this radical restructuring faced a ferocious backlash. The economic life of the South, its plantation model shattered, had to be reinvented. Without slavery, a new system of labor control emerged, including sharecropping and tenant farming, which often trapped both black and poor white farmers in cycles of debt and poverty, maintaining a rigid racial hierarchy through economic means rather than legal chains. Simultaneously, the war itself had accelerated a parallel reorganization in the north. The demands of supplying a massive army spurred industrialization at a breakneck pace, consolidating manufacturing, railroad expansion, and financial systems. The Homestead Act, passed during the war, encouraged Western settlement, shifting the nation's geographic focus. By the war's end, the United States was no longer a loose association of agrarian states, but a consolidated nation with a powerful federal government and a growing industrial powerhouse in the north. This centralization of authority was a permanent shift, settling the constitutional debate over states' rights with brutal finality. The tragedy, however, was that the reorganization remained incomplete. The political will to enforce a full social and economic transformation faded. Federal troops were withdrawn, and a campaign of terror and discriminatory laws, known as Jim Crow, systematically rolled back the gains of Reconstruction. The unresolved issues of citizenship, equality, and racial justice were not settled. They were merely deferred, leaving a deep and unhealed rift that would shape American conflict and identity for the next century. The Civil War had forcibly ended one system, but the nation's struggle to build a truly new one in its place had only just begun. The Civil War's unresolved tensions demonstrated how a nation's internal fractures can define its future for generations. But sometimes, a single political decision can cut a civilization in two, creating a wound that never fully heals. As the sun finally set on the British Empire in the middle of the 20th century, its final act in the crown jewel of India was not a graceful transfer of power, but a hurried, catastrophic surgery. The Partition of India in 1947 was less a liberation and more a violent amputation, a political division that unleashed a human tragedy of staggering proportions. The plan, hastily drawn by the last viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, was deceptively simple on a map. To appease the Muslim League's demand for a separate homeland, two new nations would be born from British India, a predominantly Hindu India and a new Muslim-majority Pakistan, itself split into two wings 1,000 miles apart. The borders, drawn in secret by a British lawyer who had never visited the region, were announced only after independence, turning lines on a map into an instant death sentence for millions. The real catastrophe was not the political declaration, but the terrifying chaos that followed in the divided provinces of Punjab and Bengal. These were not neat religious blocs, but ancient, interwoven societies where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived as neighbors for centuries. Now, with a new border suddenly cleaving through villages, farms, and city streets, that delicate social fabric was torn apart by fear and rising communal fury. The result was an explosion of horrific violence and a desperate, panicked migration on a scale the world had never seen. Trains packed with refugees arrived at stations silent, their passengers lost to attacks along the route. Entire columns of people, sometimes 1 million strong, trudged across the new frontiers in opposite directions, Hindus and Sikhs fleeing westward into India, Muslims fleeing eastward into Pakistan, abandoning everything they owned for the hope of safety. The human cost was immense, with estimates of loss reaching over 1 million lives, and some 15 million people displaced in a matter of months, making it the largest mass migration in recorded history. The reorganization forced by this catastrophe was absolute and enduring. Overnight, the political map of South Asia was redrawn, creating not one but two rival nations founded on competing state models, a secular, pluralistic India and an Islamic Republic of Pakistan. This split did not resolve tension, it institutionalized it. The dispute over the princely state of Kashmir, whose Hindu ruler chose to join India despite a Muslim-majority population, ignited the first of several full-scale wars between the two neighbors, a conflict that remains a nuclear flashpoint today. The partition also created a profound and lasting demographic shift, homogenizing what were once richly diverse regions. Cities like Lahore and Delhi were forever changed, their multicultural character simplified by the exodus of one community and the influx of another. The psychological scar became a national inheritance for both countries, a foundational trauma that shaped their literature, cinema, and political rhetoric, each defining itself in opposition to the other. The hurried stroke of a pen in 1947 did not just create two nations, it created a permanent state of rivalry, a divided subcontinent whose very identity was forged in the fires of a catastrophic and poorly planned divorce. Partition showed how political lines could sever ancient communities, but another form of line, drawn not on a map but through a 5-year plan, would lead to a different kind of severing. The Great Leap Forward, launched by Mao Zedong in 1958, was a breathtakingly ambitious campaign to transform China from an agrarian society into an industrial communist utopia, virtually overnight. Its core mechanism was the radical collectivization of agriculture. Millions of peasant households were merged into vast people's communes, where private plots, tools, and even cooking pots were abolished in favor of absolute collective living and labor. The goal was to free up manpower for a parallel crash program in backyard steel production, where farmers were ordered to smelt metal in makeshift furnaces instead of tending their fields. This was a wholesale reorganization of rural life by ideological decree, and it collided with reality with catastrophic force. To prove the plan's success, local officials, under immense pressure, began submitting wildly inflated reports of grain yields. These fantasy numbers were then taken as fact by the central government, which set procurement quotas based on them. The result was a brutal paradox. The state requisitioned more and more grain from the communes to feed cities and for export, convinced there was a surplus, while the actual farmers who grew the food were left with nothing. The reporting system had completely broken down, silencing any warning of the growing disaster. When poor weather conditions added to the strain, the fragile system snapped. The mechanisms of famine took hold with terrible efficiency. With grain reserves stripped bare, people first exhausted any available substitutes, from tree bark to grass. As the crisis deepened between 1959 and 1961, the social fabric of the communes unraveled. The very institutions meant to protect people became sites of desperation, with communal kitchens serving ever thinner gruel until they had nothing to serve at all. The scale of loss during these years is a somber chapter in modern history, with scholarly estimates suggesting a demographic impact in the tens of millions, stemming from severe malnutrition and related illness. This was a man-made catastrophe, a famine born not from a lack of food in the country, but from its forceful redistribution and the silencing of truth. The reorganization that followed was not a public reversal, but a quiet, pragmatic retreat from the most radical edges of the policy. By the early 1960s, Mao's direct control over economic policy receded. More pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping took charge of recovery, effectively dismantling the people's communes in practice if not in name. Private plots were secretly tolerated, rural markets cautiously reappeared, and the disastrous backyard steel campaign was abandoned. The state's focus shifted from ideological purity to agricultural recovery and basic stability. This unspoken pivot represented a fundamental shift in economic management, a turn toward gradual, experimental reform that would later blossom in the 1980s. But the deepest reorganization was demographic and psychological. The famine left a hollowed-out generation and a profound scar on the national consciousness. For the Chinese leadership that emerged from this period, including Deng Xiaoping himself, the lesson was indelible. food security was the absolute foundation of political security and social stability. Never again could grand ideology be allowed to override practical reality in matters of subsistence. This hard-learned caution directly influenced the incremental, trial-and-error approach of the later reform and opening period, where changes were tested in small zones before national rollout. The Great Leap Forward aimed to force a utopian reorganization through sheer will, but the catastrophe it triggered forced a different, more sober kind of change, one that prioritized full bowls over ideological purity and careful management over revolutionary frenzy. The drive for rapid, state-enforced transformation has often led to unintended catastrophe, a lesson written in the starkest terms not on a vast continental scale, but within the borders of a single, small African nation. In the spring of 1994, Rwanda was consumed by an organized campaign of violence that stands as one of the most concentrated and devastating events of the 20th century. Over the span of just 100 days, an estimated 800,000 individuals were lost, a pace and scale of human destruction that is almost impossible to comprehend. This was not a spontaneous outburst of ancient hatred, but the catastrophic culmination of decades of deliberately engineered division. The roots lay in the colonial period, when Belgian administrators rigidly codified and politicized distinctions between the Hutu and Tutsi populations, favoring one group over the other and embedding identity cards that froze a fluid social landscape into a rigid hierarchy. After independence, these manipulated divisions were exploited by successive governments, using propaganda to frame the Tutsi minority as a perpetual threat. By April 1994, when the plane carrying the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi was shot down, the machinery for catastrophe was already in place. Extremist factions within the government activated a pre-planned campaign, using radio broadcasts to direct militias and civilian mobs in a horrifically efficient wave of violence that swept from community to community. The world watched and largely failed to intervene as a society tore itself apart. From this abyss, a profound and ongoing reorganization began, spearheaded by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which ended the genocide militarily. The new leadership faced a shattered nation, a traumatized population, and a legacy of hatred woven into the fabric of daily life. Their approach to rebuilding was radical and unambiguous. The first foundational step was the official abolition of ethnic identification from public life. The government removed all mention of Hutu, Tutsi, and Twa from identity cards and public discourse, promoting a single, unified Rwandan identity as a matter of state policy. This was not merely symbolic, it was a deliberate attempt to dismantle the very categories that had been weaponized for decades. Alongside this social engineering came an aggressive drive for justice and a form of reconciliation. The international community established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda to prosecute the architects of the genocide, while Rwanda itself revived a traditional community justice system known as Gacaca. Thousands of these local courts were established across the country, aiming to process the enormous backlog of cases, allow survivors to hear the truth, and enable perpetrators who confessed to be reintegrated into their communities. The process was imperfect and deeply painful, but it represented a monumental attempt to clear a path forward without forgetting the past. Concurrently, the government embarked on a relentless project of economic development and centralization. Security and political control were consolidated in the capital, Kigali, with a focus on strict order, anti-corruption drives, and a clear vision for the future. Rwanda transformed itself into one of Africa's fastest-growing economies, investing heavily in technology, tourism, and becoming a regional hub for conferences and business. This remarkable economic story, often called the Singapore of Africa, is inseparable from the powerful, centralized state that emerged from the genocide. That state also projected its influence outward, with Rwandan troops becoming key players in peacekeeping and security missions across the continent, a dramatic shift from a nation receiving intervention to one providing it. The reorganization of Rwanda is a complex and continuing story, a society consciously rebuilding itself on principles of unity and progress while continuously navigating the profound challenges of memory, justice, and the deep scars left by 100 days that forever changed a nation. The careful reconstruction of Rwanda was a conscious effort to build a new identity from the fragments of the old. But what happens when an entire superpower, an ideology that defined half the world for generations, simply ceases to exist? The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a geopolitical earthquake that ended not just a country, but an entire world order in a matter of months. This was not a military defeat on a battlefield, but a slow-moving internal catastrophe of economic and political decay that culminated in a sudden, stunning disintegration. For decades, the Soviet command economy had prioritized heavy industry and military might over consumer goods and agricultural efficiency. By the 1980s, this system was grinding to a halt, plagued by chronic shortages, empty shelves, and a deep, demoralizing stagnation. The war in Afghanistan had become a costly quagmire, draining both resources and national spirit. Into this deepening crisis stepped Mikhail Gorbachev, who understood that the system could not continue as it was. His twin policies of perestroika, meaning restructuring of the economy, and glasnost, meaning openness or transparency in public discourse, were bold attempts to reform and save the Soviet state. But like a surgeon opening a patient only to find the illness was far more advanced than anyone knew, these reforms inadvertently triggered the system's final collapse. Glasnost allowed long-suppressed truths about Soviet history and the current economic disaster to flood into the open, shattering the state's monopoly on information and eroding its legitimacy. Perestroika's half measures failed to fix the economy, only creating more confusion and scarcity. Most critically, glasnost unleashed the powerful force of nationalism in the Soviet republics. In places like Lithuania, Ukraine, and the Caucasus, people began to openly demand greater autonomy or even full independence, testing the limits of Gorbachev's new openness. The reorganization that followed the Soviet flag being lowered over the Kremlin for the last time was vast, painful, and immediate. One superpower fractured into 15 independent nations, each facing the monumental task of building a state from scratch. The 1990s in Russia and many other post-Soviet states became known as the Wild East, a period of chaotic and often traumatic transition to a market economy. State-owned industries were sold off in a process that created a small class of ultra-wealthy oligarchs almost overnight, while pensions evaporated and savings were wiped out by hyperinflation for ordinary citizens. The ideological map of the world was redrawn in an instant. The bipolar Cold War standoff, a global tension that had defined international politics since 1945, vanished. In its place emerged a unipolar moment, with the United States standing as the world's sole superpower, a situation that reshaped alliances, military strategy, and global institutions like NATO. For the people living through it, this was a period of profound dislocation, where old certainties about jobs, identity, and the future evaporated. Yet from this chaos also came new possibilities. The end of state censorship unleashed a torrent of cultural and intellectual expression. For nations like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, it meant the restoration of independence they had lost decades before. The collapse demonstrated with startling clarity that even the most rigid, powerful structures are not permanent. They are ideas held in place by belief and force, and when that belief evaporates, the empire can dissolve not with a bang, but with a quiet, administrative sigh, leaving behind a completely new and uncertain world to be built from its pieces. The sudden end of the Soviet Union was a political dissolution, but just a few years later, a different kind of dissolution would ripple across a continent known for its astonishing economic ascent. In the summer of 1997, a financial catastrophe began in Thailand that would swiftly engulf much of East Asia, shattering the so-called economic miracles and forcing a painful new understanding of globalization's risks. For decades, nations like Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea had been the darlings of international investors, posting phenomenal growth rates as they industrialized at breakneck speed. This rapid expansion, however, was built on a fragile foundation. These economies had tied their currencies loosely to the strong United States dollar to attract foreign investment, but this created a dangerous illusion of stability. Domestic banks and corporations borrowed massive sums in dollars, believing the exchange rate would hold forever. At the same time, financial regulations in these countries had not kept pace with their explosive growth, leading to reckless lending, often to politically connected projects of dubious value. The bubble was waiting for a pin. That pin was a wave of speculative attacks. International currency traders, sensing weakness, began a massive sell-off of the Thai baht, betting it was overvalued. Thailand's central bank spent billions of its foreign reserves in a futile attempt to defend the fixed exchange rate. By July, the country was exhausted and had to let its currency float freely. The baht promptly collapsed, losing more than half its value almost overnight. This was not an isolated event. It was a contagion. The panic spread like wildfire through the region, a phenomenon economists called the Asian flu. Investors, gripped by fear, pulled their money out of Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines, triggering a domino effect of currency collapses and banking crises. The scale of the reversal was breathtaking. Economies that had grown by 8 or 9% a year suddenly contracted. Companies that had borrowed in dollars now faced crushing debt burdens as their local currency revenues plummeted in value. Banks failed, construction projects froze, and unemployment soared. The once vibrant streets of Bangkok and Jakarta were shadowed by anxiety as a middle class that had just begun to thrive saw its savings evaporate and its future vanish. The reorganization demanded by this catastrophe was directed, in large part, from outside. Desperate for liquidity to stabilize their economies, countries like South Korea and Indonesia had no choice but to seek emergency loans from the International Monetary Fund. The IMF imposed strict conditions in exchange for this bailout, a package of reforms known as structural adjustment. These measures were deeply controversial and often painful. They required governments to cut public spending, raise interest rates to stabilize currencies, and force the closure of insolvent banks and corporations. While intended to restore fiscal discipline and market confidence, these policies also led to severe social hardship, deepening recessions and sparking waves of public protest. The lasting reorganization, however, came from within the region itself. The crisis forged a new economic orthodoxy across East Asia. Nations built up enormous war chests of foreign exchange reserves, a defensive buffer to ensure they could never again be so vulnerable to speculative attacks. They reformed and strengthened their financial regulatory systems, imposing stricter oversight on banks and corporate borrowing. There was also a profound psychological shift, a deep-seated wariness of the volatile hot money of global capital flows, and a renewed emphasis on building resilient domestic economies. Perhaps the most significant geopolitical reorganization was the clear emergence of China as the region's new economic anchor. While its currency was not fully convertible and its financial system was more closed, China avoided the worst of the crisis. It maintained stability and even refused to devalue its own currency, a move that prevented a further competitive spiral and earned it immense diplomatic goodwill. In the aftermath, as other economies recovered, China's growth accelerated, drawing the region into its manufacturing and trade orbit. The Asian financial crisis was a brutal lesson in the interconnected perils of a globalized world. It proved that economic miracles could unravel in mere weeks, and it forced a fundamental reorganization, turning fast-growing tigers into more cautious, self-protective dragons, forever altering the balance of economic power in the process. The sudden economic unraveling in Asia exposed the fragility of a newly globalized world, but on the other side of that same globe, another unraveling was already underway, this one far more visceral and violent. As the rigid structures of the Cold War dissolved, they released long-frozen tensions in regions once held together by authoritarian force. Nowhere was this more tragically clear than in the Balkans, where the multi-ethnic Federation of Yugoslavia disintegrated into a series of brutal conflicts throughout the 1990s. This was not a single war, but a cascade of them, a catastrophic process of dissolution where the dream of a unified, socialist state shattered into the nightmare of competing ethnic nationalisms. For decades, the strongman rule of Josip Broz Tito had suppressed these ancient rivalries, binding together Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, and others under a banner of brotherhood and unity. But after Tito's passing, and with the end of the Cold War removing the geopolitical glue that held the Federation in place, opportunistic politicians found they could gain power by resurrecting and weaponizing old fears and historical grievances. The result was a decade of horror that returned warfare and terms like ethnic cleansing to the European continent. The wars began with Slovenia's brief, successful fight for independence in 1991, but quickly escalated into far more vicious conflicts in Croatia and then Bosnia and Herzegovina. Here, the goal was not just independence, but the violent redrawing of maps along ethnic lines. Militias and remnants of the Yugoslav army embarked on campaigns of terror, shelling cities like Sarajevo and Vukovar, and systematically targeting civilian populations to force them from their homes in a brutal effort to create ethnically pure territories. The conflict reached its darkest point in July 1995 in the town of Srebrenica, a United Nations-declared safe area in eastern Bosnia. Bosnian Serb forces overran the enclave and in the days that followed, carried out the systematic loss of more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys. It was the worst single atrocity on European soil since the Second World War, a stark reminder of how quickly civilized norms could collapse. The reorganization forced by this catastrophe was comprehensive and painful, redrawing the political map of southeastern Europe. From the wreckage of one Yugoslavia, 7 new independent nations eventually emerged: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and later Kosovo. This political birth was accompanied by immense human displacement, with millions becoming refugees or internally displaced persons, their homes destroyed or now located on the wrong side of a new ethnic border. The international community, after years of failed diplomacy and peacekeeping, was finally compelled to act directly. In 1995, NATO launched its first ever combat operations, conducting airstrikes against Bosnian Serb positions, which helped force the warring parties to the negotiating table. The resulting Dayton Accords created the complex, internationally supervised state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a fragile peace built on ethnic power sharing. Perhaps the most significant lasting reorganization was legal and moral. The sheer scale of the atrocities prompted the United Nations to establish the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the first international war crimes court since Nuremberg. This was a new feature of the post-Cold War order, an attempt to assert that even in the chaos of ethnic conflict, there existed a universal standard of justice, and that political and military leaders could be held individually accountable for crimes against humanity. The tribunal's work, while controversial and imperfect, set a precedent, signaling that sovereignty was not an absolute shield against international law. The Yugoslav Wars proved that the end of superpower rivalry did not mean an end to history's darker impulses, but it also forced the world to develop new, agonizingly imperfect tools to manage the violent reorganization of nations. The violent fragmentation of nations is a human catastrophe, but the planet itself can deliver a blow of such raw, indiscriminate force it rewrites our relationship with the natural world. On the morning of December 26, 2004, a rupture in the ocean floor off the coast of Sumatra unleashed energy equivalent to 23,000 Hiroshima-type atomic bombs. The resulting earthquake, one of the most powerful ever recorded, lifted the seafloor by several meters, displacing trillions of gallons of water and sending a series of colossal waves racing across the Indian Ocean at the speed of a jetliner. For coastal communities from Indonesia to Africa, it was a day that began in ordinary fashion, with no warning of the walls of water about to arrive. The tsunami's geographic scale was unprecedented, striking coastlines in 14 countries, with Indonesia's Aceh province, Sri Lanka, Thailand, India, and the Maldives suffering the most profound devastation. The force of the waves erased entire towns, scouring landscapes down to the bedrock and leaving behind a surreal, mud-caked wasteland. The loss of life was immense, with a final toll exceeding 230,000 individuals across the region, a number that speaks to the sheer suddenness and overwhelming power of the event. It was a natural catastrophe that revealed, in the starkest terms, how interconnected and vulnerable our world truly is. The reorganization it forced was immediate, global, and focused on preventing such a blind-sided tragedy from ever happening again. The most direct response was the rapid creation and enhancement of international tsunami early warning systems. Prior to 2004, a coordinated alert network for the Indian Ocean simply did not exist. In the aftermath, nations poured resources into a new system of deep ocean assessment and reporting buoys, seismic monitors, and communication protocols designed to detect an undersea earthquake and model a potential tsunami within minutes, issuing alerts to at-risk coastlines. This was a technological reorganization of our planetary defenses, a collective acknowledgement that such disasters do not respect national borders. On a local level, the catastrophe forced a painful but necessary reassessment of coastal development and zoning laws. In places like Thailand and Sri Lanka, where tourist resorts and fishing villages had been built right on the beach, the waves demonstrated the fatal cost of ignoring natural buffers. In the years that followed, governments implemented stricter building codes, mandated setbacks from the shoreline, and in some areas restored protective mangrove forests and coral reefs that could absorb wave energy. This represented a philosophical shift, a move away from seeing the coastline as mere real estate to understanding it as a dynamic, sometimes dangerous interface that requires respectful planning. Furthermore, the global humanitarian response, while initially overwhelmed by the scale, led to a major reassessment of international disaster coordination. The sheer number of affected nations and the complexity of delivering aid across multiple jurisdictions highlighted gaps in logistics, communication, and cooperation between military and civilian agencies. Lessons learned from the tsunami response directly influenced the protocols of organizations like the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, leading to more standardized approaches for future large-scale disasters. The 2004 tsunami was a reminder of nature's awesome power, but the legacy it left is not one of helplessness. It forced humanity to reorganize its tools, its laws, and its collective mindset, building a world that listens more closely to the tremors of the earth and stands a little more prepared for the moment the ocean rises up. A tsunami of water receded, but a tsunami of paper was about to crash ashore. The global financial system, a complex and seemingly solid edifice built over decades, proved to be a house of cards waiting for a single tremor. That tremor was the collapse of the United States housing market, and the catastrophe it triggered in 2008 was not a natural disaster, but a man-made failure of breathtaking scale. For years, a powerful illusion had fueled the economy. Lenders, chasing profits, offered mortgages to borrowers with little ability to repay, known as subprime loans. These risky loans were then bundled together into complex financial products called mortgage-backed securities, which were sliced, repackaged, and sold around the world to banks and investors who believed they were safe. The entire system was built on the assumption that American housing prices would only ever go up. When they finally began to fall in 2006 and 2007, the illusion shattered. Homeowners defaulted, the value of those exotic securities plummeted, and the losses began to cascade through the interconnected global banking system. The crisis reached its terrifying climax in September 2008, when the investment bank Lehman Brothers, overwhelmed by toxic assets, was allowed to fail. This single event triggered a global cardiac arrest. Credit, the lifeblood of the modern economy, froze completely. Major institutions like the insurance giant AIG teetered on the brink, and for a moment, it seemed the entire architecture of global finance might come crashing down, plunging the world into a second Great Depression. The immediate human cost was a deep global recession. Millions lost their jobs, their homes, and their life savings as stock markets cratered and economic activity ground to a halt. The catastrophe was so severe it forced a radical and controversial reorganization of the economic order. Governments and central banks, facing an existential threat, took unprecedented action. They orchestrated massive bailouts, using public funds to rescue the very banks whose risk-taking had caused the disaster, arguing they were too big to fail. Central banks, led by the United States Federal Reserve, embarked on a novel policy called quantitative easing, essentially creating vast sums of new money to buy financial assets and pump liquidity back into the paralyzed system. This was a fundamental rewriting of the rulebook for managing economies. The long-term reorganization, however, was about building new guardrails. In the United States, this took the form of the Dodd-Frank Act, a sweeping set of financial regulations designed to prevent a repeat. It aimed to increase transparency for complex derivatives, create mechanisms to safely wind down failing giants, and establish greater consumer protections. Globally, banking capital requirements were strengthened to ensure institutions could better withstand future shocks. Yet, perhaps the most profound and lasting reorganization was not legal but psychological. The crisis eroded public trust in financial institutions, technocratic experts, and the very idea that markets were self-correcting. It fueled widespread political anger and populist movements on both the left and right, who channeled the frustration over austerity measures and the perception that the wealthy had been rescued while ordinary people bore the cost. This loss of faith in established systems created a political volatility that is still with us today. Furthermore, the crisis accelerated a shift in global economic momentum. As the developed West struggled with sluggish growth and heavy debt, emerging markets, particularly China, weathered the storm with massive stimulus and continued expansion. Their relative resilience marked a decisive step in the rebalancing of global economic power away from the Atlantic and toward the Pacific. The 2008 crisis proved that our most sophisticated systems contain hidden, catastrophic flaws, and that preserving them sometimes requires measures that feel deeply unjust, reshaping not just economies, but the very social contract between citizens and the institutions meant to protect them. A financial crisis can reshape economies, but a crisis of state can shatter an entire region, sending shockwaves across the globe. In the spring of 2011, a wave of popular protest swept through the Arab world, and in Syria it met a wall of force. What began as peaceful demonstrations for reform quickly escalated into a brutal crackdown, then a fragmented armed rebellion, and finally a devastating multi-sided civil war that continues to this day. The conflict drew in a dizzying array of actors, from regional powers like Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia backing opposing factions, to the direct military intervention of Russia in support of the Syrian government, and the involvement of the United States and a coalition targeting the extremist group known as the Islamic State. This internationalization turned a national struggle into a catastrophic proxy war, with Syrian cities like Aleppo and Homs becoming the battlegrounds where global and regional rivalries were fought. The human cost has been staggering, with estimates of loss reaching well into the hundreds of thousands, and a profound humanitarian crisis unfolding for those who remained. The most visible reorganization, however, was one of mass movement. The relentless violence and hardship forced over half of Syria's pre-war population from their homes, creating the largest displacement crisis since the Second World War. While millions were internally displaced, nearly 7 million others fled across borders, seeking refuge primarily in neighboring Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, but also undertaking perilous journeys toward Europe. This wave of humanity did not just represent individual tragedy. It became a geopolitical force that forcibly reorganized politics far beyond the Middle East. In Europe, the sudden arrival of over 1 million asylum seekers in 2015 tested the continent's unity and its foundational ideals. The crisis fueled the rise of nationalist and populist political parties who stoked fears over security and cultural identity, leading to the closure of borders within the Schengen free travel zone and a profound hardening of European migration policy. The European Union's struggle to formulate a collective, humane response exposed deep fissures between member states, a reorganization of priorities where border control often trumped solidarity. Simultaneously, the war triggered a dramatic realignment of power within the Middle East itself. The conflict became the arena where regional ambitions collided. Russia's military intervention in 2015 marked its decisive return as a major power broker in the region, shoring up the Syrian government and securing its own strategic interests. Iran deepened its influence through its support for the government and allied militias, extending a corridor of Shia influence from Tehran to the Mediterranean. Turkey, initially supporting certain rebel groups, later intervened to secure its border and counter Kurdish militias it viewed as terrorists, occupying swaths of northern Syria. This complex chess game of foreign involvement permanently altered the regional balance of power, creating a new, unstable status quo where Syria's sovereignty was fragmented among competing spheres of influence. Within this chaos, another form of reorganization briefly took violent shape: the rise and fall of the so-called Islamic State. Exploiting the vacuum of authority in eastern Syria and western Iraq, ISIS declared a caliphate, a proto-state that imposed its brutal rule over millions and attracted foreign fighters from around the world. Its sudden expansion and horrific acts forced a new kind of global military coalition into being, one focused on counter-terrorism rather than traditional state versus state conflict. The eventual territorial defeat of ISIS by 2019 did not end the ideology, but it demonstrated how civil war could birth monstrous new entities that demand their own, focused international response. Perhaps the most enduring reorganization is societal and global. The Syrian refugee crisis created a long-term challenge of integration for host countries from Germany to Lebanon, straining resources and social cohesion. It sparked worldwide debates about responsibility, compassion, and identity in an interconnected world. The images of families on treacherous boats and children in dusty camps forced a new, uncomfortable awareness of the long-term human consequences of state collapse. a reminder that the lines on a map are not just political, but the very fabric of millions of lives. And when those lines dissolve into violence, the world is compelled to reorganize itself around the aftermath. Even as the Syrian conflict reshaped borders and politics, a different kind of border was being crossed by an invisible agent, one that would challenge the very concept of a border at all. In the final days of 2019, a novel coronavirus emerged, and within months it had woven itself into the fabric of global life, triggering a health crisis of a scale not seen in a century. This was not a localized disaster, but a simultaneous global event, a shared experience of isolation and anxiety that touched every nation. The virus spread with alarming speed, exploiting the very connections of our modern world, international travel, and dense urban living. Hospitals in cities from Bergamo to New York City faced overwhelming strain, with intensive care units pushed to their limits and healthcare workers performing heroic, exhausting duties under immense pressure. The public health response was something the modern world had never attempted on such a scale. Widespread lockdowns that paused economies, closed schools, and confined billions to their homes in an effort to slow the transmission. For a time, the hum of daily life was replaced by an eerie quiet, a global pause that forced a sudden and profound confrontation with our way of living. The reorganization sparked by this pause is still unfolding, but its contours are already reshaping society in fundamental ways. Perhaps the most visible shift was the massive, forced experiment in remote work. Offices emptied as knowledge workers set up laptops on kitchen tables, proving that for many industries, physical presence was not a necessity. This exodus from city centers altered real estate markets, reduced commuter traffic, and blurred the lines between home and work in a lasting way. Parallel to this was the explosive acceleration of digital commerce. Online shopping became a lifeline, not a convenience, pushing even the most reluctant consumers and traditional businesses into the digital sphere. Restaurants pivoted to delivery, fitness instructors streamed classes from their living rooms, and doctors began consulting patients via video call. The pandemic acted as a decade's worth of catalyst for digital adoption in a matter of months. This digital leap, however, exposed the fragility of our physical systems. Global supply chains, optimized for just-in-time efficiency over resilience, snapped under the pressure. A shortage in a semiconductor factory in Asia could halt automobile production in Germany. The scarcity of everyday items, from medical supplies to lumber, revealed a world deeply interconnected yet surprisingly vulnerable. In response, nations and companies began a painful reevaluation, seeking to shorten supply lines, stockpile critical components, and build more redundancy, a move away from pure efficiency toward greater security. The crisis also triggered a scientific mobilization of unprecedented speed. The development of effective vaccines using groundbreaking messenger RNA technology was compressed from years into mere months, a testament to global cooperation and focused investment. Yet the distribution of those vaccines laid bare deep global inequalities, a stark reorganization of access along the lines of wealth and geopolitical influence. Beyond economics and medicine, the pandemic forced a deep reevaluation of our shared infrastructure. Public health, long an underfunded and overlooked sector in many countries, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. The capacity for testing, contact tracing, and data sharing became critical measures of national competence. Social behaviors were rewritten, with handshakes giving way to elbow bumps, masks becoming a common sight, and a new collective awareness of airborne transmission altering how we gather. Perhaps the most complex and divisive reorganization has been in the realm of trust. The crisis became a prism, refracting political and scientific information into polarized narratives. Debates over lockdown measures, vaccine mandates, and the origins of the virus eroded consensus and deepened societal fractures in many nations. challenging the very idea of a common truth in a public health emergency. The pandemic proved that the greatest catastrophes are not just measured in loss of life, but in how they force us to renegotiate the most basic contracts of society: work, commerce, science, and our trust in one another. It revealed both our astonishing adaptability and our profound vulnerabilities, leaving a world that is, in many ways, permanently reorganized, still learning the full lessons of a shared storm that paused the globe. These 25 stories are not isolated tragedies. They are variations on a theme, a recurring rhythm in the long song of human history. If we step back from the specific dates and names, a pattern emerges, a blueprint for how civilizations reach their breaking point and what happens after the fracture. The catalysts, while unique in their details, often share a dangerous synergy. A civilization rarely falls to a single blow. Instead, it is the convergence of multiple pressures that creates a fatal trap. Environmental stress, like a prolonged drought or a sudden climatic shift, weakens the agricultural foundation. Economic strain, whether from resource depletion, reckless debt, or broken trade networks, tightens the vise. And social inequality or political rigidity often prevents a flexible response, turning hardship into resentment and internal conflict. It is the combination that proves deadly, the earthquake that hits a city already weakened by poor construction and social unrest. The Bronze Age collapse saw climate, invasion, and systemic trade failure converge. The fall of Rome intertwined military overextension, economic stagnation, and political decay. Even the 2008 financial crisis was a perfect storm of predatory lending, regulatory failure, and a blind faith in endless growth. The vulnerability lies in the links between these systems, when a shock in one area cascades uncontrollably through all the others. Just as patterns define the collapse, so too do they shape the reorganization that follows. The aftermath is not random chaos, but a constrained set of societal adaptations. One of the most common is a dramatic shift in where power is held. In the wake of catastrophe, authority often either centralizes fiercely or fragments completely. After the Mongol invasions, a single, brutal authority imposed the Pax Mongolica to stabilize trade routes. Conversely, the fall of Rome saw power shatter into 1,000 feudal pieces, decentralizing for centuries. New ideologies or spiritual frameworks almost always rise to fill the void of meaning left by the disaster. The Black Death's trauma fueled both religious doubt and a new focus on individual life, nudging Europe toward the Renaissance. The Maya collapse saw the cult of the God King give way to more collective, council-based rule. And in the ashes of the transatlantic system, enslaved peoples forged powerful new syncretic faiths that preserved identity and fostered resilience. Technological adaptation is another relentless force in the reorganization phase. Necessity becomes the mother of invention, but sometimes the invention is about rediscovery or finding a new use for an old tool. The Bronze Age collapse, which shattered the tin trade, forced a widespread turn to ironworking, ushering in a new age. The labor shortages after the Black Death accelerated the development of labor-saving devices. And our own recent pandemic forced a global, rapid adoption of digital tools for work, commerce, and medicine, compressing a decade of change into 2 years. Finally, social hierarchies are almost always scrambled. The old elites may be discredited or destroyed, creating space for new groups to rise. The Black Death empowered peasant laborers to demand better wages, shaking the foundations of feudalism. The Taiping Rebellion, though crushed, permanently shifted power in China from the Manchu court to Han Chinese provincial leaders. Reorganization rewrites the social contract, for better or for worse. It is crucial to understand that this reorganization is not synonymous with progress. It is simply transformation. The new order that emerges from the ashes can be more just, more resilient, and more creative, as seen in the cultural fusions of the post-conquest Americas or the innovative spirit after a pandemic. But it can also be more brutal, more unequal, or more fragile. The transatlantic system reorganized societies around a horrific new ideology of racial hierarchy. The Peace of Westphalia ended a devastating war but cemented the principle that rulers could dictate the faith of their subjects, forcing heartbreaking personal choices. Reorganization is the necessary next step, but its moral direction is not predetermined by the catastrophe that caused it. It is determined by the choices, the power struggles, and the ideas that fill the silence after the old world ends. This cycle of stability, crisis, collapse, and rebirth is not a flaw in human history. It is its engine. Each catastrophe, however painful, clears ground that had become infertile, making space for new seeds to grow. The story of our species is not one of linear ascent, but of repeated, necessary reinvention. We are not creatures who simply build. We are creatures who are forced again and again to rebuild. And in that endless, often traumatic process of rebuilding lies our strange, stubborn genius. The rhythm of history is not a gentle tide, but a series of shattering waves. Each catastrophe we have explored, from silent droughts to world-spanning pandemics, demonstrates a fundamental truth. Civilizations are not static monuments, but dynamic systems in a constant state of tension. They build, they strain, and when the pressure from within or without becomes too great, they break. Yet it is in that very breaking that the most profound work of human history is done. These devastating shocks have been, paradoxically, the engines for our most significant transformations. They have redrawn maps, not just of land, but of power, forcing the decentralization of Rome into feudalism and the recentralization of authority after the Mongol conquests. They have rewritten economies, shattering the palace treasuries of the Bronze Age to make way for Iron Age traders, and vaporizing the financial certainties of 2008 to demand new global regulations. Most importantly, they have relentlessly reshaped society itself, scrambling old hierarchies after the Black Death, forging new identities in the crucible of the transatlantic system, and accelerating our digital lives almost overnight during a global health crisis. The collapse is the end of one story, but the painful, creative, and often unintended reorganization that follows is the beginning of the next. This cyclical pattern of stability, crisis, and rebirth is not a record of failure, but a testament to a strange and stubborn human capacity. We are not builders who create perfect, eternal structures. We are rebuilders. Our genius lies in our relentless, often improvised, ability to take the pieces of a shattered world and assemble them into something new, for better or for worse. Understanding these past reorganizations, then, is more than an academic exercise. It is a crucial lens for viewing our own precarious moment. Our contemporary global society faces its own converging pressures, climatic shifts, geopolitical fractures, and the ever-present threat of novel pathogens. While the specific challenges are new, the underlying dynamics are ancient. How will our interconnected systems withstand the next great shock? Will our responses centralize power or distribute it? What new ideologies or technologies will rise to meet the crisis? The past does not offer a precise blueprint, but it provides a sobering and ultimately hopeful perspective. It tells us that catastrophe, while deeply painful, has always been a catalyst. It clears the ground, however brutally, for new ways of living, thinking, and organizing ourselves to emerge. The question for us now is not if we will face such a catalyst, but what we will choose to build from its aftermath. We would love to hear your perspective on this journey through collapse and rebirth. In your view, which of these 25 catastrophes most powerfully reveals humanity's dual capacity for destruction and astonishing resilience? Share your thoughts in the comments below.